Great, thank you, and good afternoon everyone, and a huge and warm welcome to our live and ticking event today. Thank you for joining us on this very autumnal afternoon. We're so delighted that so many of you can join us for this hour, and hope that you find the content really interesting. I'm really looking forward to it, and encourage you also to engage with us, to share questions, and we're going to be asking you a couple actually in a poll as we go. So I'm delighted to be joined by a couple of colleagues for this afternoon's really important session focused on stroke research. So you'll be hearing some amazing information about the research that the British Heart Foundation funds, but also about the BHF itself from colleagues. Firstly, from my colleague and our Associate Medical Director, Professor James Leiper, who's also Professor of Molecular Medicine at the University of Glasgow, and also Professor Keith Muir, who's a Professor of Clinical Imaging and a Consultant Neurologist at the University of Glasgow too. So a good Scottish representation from our BHF Scotland and BHF today, and I know we're in for a treat. So before I start, and again, thank you for joining us, I'd also like to say what a pleasure it is to have you join us at this challenging time. I hope this finds you and your families well. I know it's challenging for many people professionally and personally. And to all of you who support the British Heart Foundation and keep our life-saving work going, huge thanks from me and everybody at the BHF. We were really delighted also to have so many of you join us last night at our BHF Heart Heroes Awards, which were just so wonderful. It was just beautiful to take a few moments to celebrate the contributions of so many people and organisations that make our BHF family and enable us to support the brilliant research of which you'll hear more about tonight. And it does remain a challenging time for us as a BHF, as it does for so many organisations. We are facing, of course, as everyone, tough headwinds. So every bit of support and fundraising that you help give to our work makes a huge difference. And for that, you have mine and everybody at the BHF's thanks. So without further ado, I'm going to give just give a headline about what we're going to cover today. So we've got just under an hour together, and we promise to let you go at 5 o'clock to get on with your evenings. So I'm going to hand over in a moment to James, who is going to be giving you a bit of an overview about stroke research and the research that the British Heart Foundation funds and why it's so vitally important, before he hands over to Keith, and Keith tells us some more about the exciting work and research that he has underway. One thing I'd really love to say before we start is we're really proud to be working in partnership with the Stroke Association, as well as many other charities, and Keith will share some of the work that he does funded by others as well. In this time, more than ever, working in partnership with other organisations is critically important to make sure that we work really effectively together to make your and other donor support go as far as it possibly can in making a difference in people's lives. So I look forward to hearing more from you in the questions. And before we get going, actually, I've got one question to ask you, if you wouldn't mind. We can ask you a poll question. We'll come back to it at the end, which is on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest and 1 the lowest. How much do you feel you know about stroke? So just going to give you a couple of moments to respond to that. I can see all the results coming in, so thank you for engaging. Look at that. My goodness, and I'll ask my colleagues behind the scenes to give me the thumbs up when they've closed the poll. Thank you. And if I think we're clicking sharing results now, so you can see it. So let's just take a moment to look at that. So gosh, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5's the highest and 1's the lowest, it looks like most of us are somewhere in the middle, that we feel, a little bit. And so the majority of people roughly in the middle of that scale, with an even spread either side. So we'll come back to that and see how we feel about that at the end of this session. But without further ado, I'd really love to hand over to my colleague, Professor James Leiper. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Charmaine. And just to reiterate, I'm delighted to be here this evening and to be able to speak to you about the work of the BHF, the research that we do, and particularly its relevance to stroke. And I thought I would start by just spending a moment or two talking about the current situation that we all find ourselves in. Clearly unprecedented times. Nobody would have thought, I think, at the beginning of the year, anything like this could have happened. For me personally, I was delighted last year to be asked to join the British Heart Foundation as Associate Medical Director, and leapt at the chance to do it. And it's a great honour to serve this charity. I signed up in November last year. and joined on the 1st of April this year, I had no idea, of course, what was going to happen. You know, the world has been turned upside down, and we've all had, you know, our liberty restricted to some degree, and it's been a very tough time. You'll have heard, I think, in the news about how charities have been hit during the pandemic. You know, all of our shops were closed when the pandemic restrictions came in. I didn't realise when I joined the BHF that we have 750 shops across the UK. This is a massive retail operation, and it went overnight from being an income generator to actually being a cost to the British Heart Foundation. This has really hit our research funds very hard. And we estimate this year that our research funding will be cut by £50 million. So cutting in half the amount of life-saving research that we can fund. And it's only really due to the dedication and hard work of our staff and our volunteers and our supporters that we're able to maintain this level of funding. And we're extremely grateful for that. Now, it's undoubtedly a very tough situation to be in, but there are some really positive and inspiring stories that I've encountered since I've been at the BHF. And I just want to share one or two of those with you to show actually how dedicated the people within the BHF are, how dedicated our supporters are, and how we've adapted to the COVID-19 crisis. So the first thing that we did was that we released our BHF staff to go and fight COVID. So our clinical training fellows were released from their research jobs and allowed to go back into the clinic, back into the hospital to fight COVID and save lives. Our basic research scientists were allowed to go and participate in the Lighthouse testing labs. And in Glasgow, where I'm based, our lab equipment was taken from our labs, moved to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Our staff went over to the Queen Elizabeth and established COVID testing in Glasgow. And it's now one of the 3 Lighthouse labs. So this is a really inspiring story, actually, about how people, when they're faced with adversity, can turn things around very, very quickly and adapt. And we're extremely proud of our staff and our researchers and how they've tackled this. The second thing that we did was we realized that our young investigators that we fund are the leaders of tomorrow. So we fund PhD students and clinical researchers to do very leading edge cardiovascular research. These people are at the beginning of their careers, and they will turn into the professors of tomorrow. So we acted very quickly to make sure that we protected them. We extended the length of their grants. There was a cost associated with it, so it was a big decision to make. But we realized that these people are the people that will build up cardiovascular research again after this pandemic. And we're very proud of being able to do that. The third thing that we did is, as a consequence of BHF having funded cardiovascular research in the UK for 60 years, we've built up a massive infrastructure of researchers, clinicians, institutes and centres, which we very quickly mobilised to capture the information about cardiovascular disease and COVID-19. We've all seen in the press that people with underlying cardiovascular diseases have worse outcomes in COVID-19, and we wanted to understand why. We managed to get 30 of the UK leading cardiovascular scientists in a room within a week to evaluate projects. They went away and reviewed those projects over the weekend in their own time, came back to us on Monday and told us which ones we should support going forward. And there are now more than 6 of these flagship projects that we've established that will try to understand why people with cardiovascular disease have worse outcomes in COVID-19, how we can prevent that happening, and how we can have better outcomes from this pandemic. So I think those are just 3 kind of inspiring examples, actually, of, in an adversity situation, how we can adapt and how we can fight COVID-19 and recover from this situation. So that being said, I now want to turn to the topic of today's broadcast, which is stroke. And not many people know, but there are 3 different types of stroke. There's ischemic strokes, which are caused by a cut-off of the blood supply to the brain. And so if the blood supply is cut off, oxygen doesn't get to the brain and cells around the blood vessels can die. This accounts for most of the strokes that we see clinically, and it's caused predominantly by blood clots in those blood vessels, occluding blood flow. The second type is hemorrhagic stroke. It's very difficult to say. And it actually just comes from a burst blood vessel, a burst or leaking blood vessel in the brain, where blood gets out of the blood vessel, pressure builds up, and that causes the stroke symptoms. And the third are called mini strokes or TIAs. These are very transient. They may only last 5 minutes, and one can recover completely from them. These are caused by little occlusions, often little clots in the brain, which cut off blood supply. And although people recover from them, they're warning signals. So mini strokes are predictive of having a major stroke later down the line. So if one suffers from a mini stroke, one must act quickly, go and see a relevant clinician and get checked out. So those are the three sorts of stroke that occur. Now, clearly, I've described in all of those blood vessels. So stroke is a vascular disease, and the British Heart Foundation funds cardiac and vascular research. So we're very proud to have funded over a number of years research into stroke. And so at this point, I get to ask a poll question. And what I would like to ask you is, how much research do you think that the BHF funds in stroke? Do you think it's 22 million, 13 million, or 5 million? Right, we can see now your responses coming in. We'll just give a few more seconds. Ah, interesting. Okay, so the popular answer was 13 million, and 61% of you said 13 million. It's actually 22 million pounds. So the BHF has funded 22 million pounds worth of research into stroke, and it's really delivered. So if I just pick out three highlights from our funding in stroke. So in the 1980s, we did epidemiological studies, so studies of cohorts, and we showed that atrial fibrillation, so a miss rhythm in your heart, is the major cause of stroke. We moved on then into the 2000s with the heart protection study, where we showed that statins could protect you against stroke. So these are wonderful drugs that are widely used now, and we know that they protect you against strokes. This is a major change in the way patients at risk of stroke were treated. Then moving into the genomic era of DNA sequencing and understanding, risk genes for stroke, we've identified risk genes for stroke. So we can now, at the DNA level, tell if you are at risk of a stroke. So those are just three of the many contributions that we've made to understanding the causes of stroke and discovering new treatments for stroke. And so I think that that's an apt point for me now to stop talking, you'll be pleased to hear, and to introduce Keith Muir, Professor Keith Muir, who's Chair of Clinical Imaging at the University of Glasgow. So over to you, Keith.
Thank you very much indeed, James. Thank you, Charmaine, also for the introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon and able to speak to people, even if it's in a rather more impersonal fashion than usual. I'm going to try and share some pictures with you, which are going to, which I will hope we can get people to see if I do this correctly, and that one I hope is visible. We have thumbs up coming there. So I'll just try to give you a little bit of the background to what we're currently doing and the research work that we're doing. I'd emphasise throughout that my role is very much as a clinician. This is where I work, and it's not a laboratory, or most of it currently isn't a laboratory. It's one of the largest hospital sites in Europe. This large construction here is the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow. Opened in 2015 at a cost of about £840 million, and it brought together 4 fairly large hospitals in their own right, which is where we spend our time recruiting patients to the studies that we do. So it's very much frontline clinical activity that's our major concern, and a great proportion of what I'm involved in requires us to get patients seen as quickly as possible, recruited into studies often within minutes of arriving in hospital, and then trying to do as much detailed study of their condition as possible with my particular interest being in scanning and imaging bits of the brain and blood vessels. So very much a clinically focused activity. The message that we've had from stroke research over the last 25 years really is that stroke has evolved out of all recognition. Compared with when I was a medical student, a junior doctor, it's turned from being a fairly sleepy backwater of medicine into one of the most time-pressured and important areas. Strokes, big strokes or small strokes, are a medical emergency. We can save brain tissue. We can prevent people having strokes. We can prevent them going on to develop the unpleasant consequences of stroke, which cause disability, which cause vascular dementia. But in order to do so, we have to act quickly. And it's become a very key critical medical emergency over that time, largely because of our advances in understanding and in treatments. And that's what I'm going to focus on. Globally, strokes of all kinds come in number 2 in the league table of global health problems as far as disability is concerned. And stroke is much more likely to leave you disabled than it is to kill you immediately. So it's a huge burden on people, on families and individuals and society as a consequence of the disability. Most strokes, as James has mentioned, are what we call ischemic strokes. A blood clot travels up to block an artery in the brain, and brain tissue does not survive for terribly long. So a great proportion of what we do, and what I'm going to concentrate on tonight, is the ability to try and treat people with that type of stroke, which represents about 80 to 90% of all the strokes that we encounter. Now, the advertising campaign that was run to try and educate people about the symptoms that might signify stroke and encourage people to seek attention for it, the FAST campaign, was very successful. And this highlights a number of the symptoms that might tell you you're having a stroke. It's designed to be sensitive to picking things up, but not very specific. So we see a lot of people with weak faces and slurred speech in Glasgow on a Friday evening. They haven't all had strokes. So we do have a bit of work to do after we see people with these symptoms to say, is this a stroke, and define why. But the important bit about the whole process is really the T. And the time critical element is one of the major elements of what we have to deal with. And this is largely based on the idea that if we restore blood supply to the brain, we can save brain tissue, but we don't have very long to do it. If we take somebody who has blocked off a major artery in the brain, as they have in this picture, we can map out how much of the brain tissue is at risk of dying. And the brain is a very hungry organ. It needs a constant supply of oxygen and sugar to keep it going. If you cut off the blood supply and stop the flow of these nutrients, tissue doesn't survive for terribly long. In the average person, it's probably at most a few hours that you have to restore the blood flow and try and avoid permanent tissue damage. If we do that, as was the case in this individual, this lady was successfully treated, blood supply comes back and the damage is very limited. Most of the tissue that was at risk survives, and consequently, this is somebody who got better and went home quickly. But we have, as we say, little time to do it. Through data from 9 clinical trials, 6,000, almost 7,000 patients involved, what's quite clear is that the clock is not on our side in the stroke world, that with every passing minute, we are losing more brain cells. You can break it down to look at it in this way and say, well, if we give somebody a clot-busting drug to treat the stroke, try and unblock the blocked artery, if we do that in the first 90 minutes after symptoms come on, we get 1 extra person free of disability for every 5 we treat. If we treat people in the next 90 minutes after that, then it's only 1 in every 9. And if we treat people in the next 90 minutes, it's 1 in every 19. So the benefit declines really very, very quickly over quite short periods of time. In Helsinki, they calculated for every 10 minutes delay in treatment, it turns into about 1 month of disability-free life that you lose. So time is not on our side. Clot-busting drugs, however, are a pretty effective treatment and have been a revolution in how we approach stroke. So that if you take, in this little cartoon prepared by one of my colleagues in America, 100 people treated with a clot-busting drug given within 3 hours, then we make a difference to all these little people in green. lots of people avoid disability as a consequence of treatment. Presumably, the clot has been dissolved and dissolved quickly enough to save a lot of brain tissue. Lots of people remain in white. They're neither better nor worse, presumably because the clot hasn't been broken down either effectively or quickly enough to save the brain tissue. And at the other end of the spectrum, we know that treatment sometimes has adverse effects, in this case mostly causing bleeding in the brain. The big white blobs in the brain scans are blood. And if you restore the blood supply too late, when a lot of brain tissue has already died, then you can cause bleeding and make the situation worse. So our current treatment is good, but it's got room for improvement. And what we've been researching is a drug called tenecteplase, which is a clot-busting drug that may have advantages over our current standard treatment. It has some that are based around pharmacology. It sticks more specifically to the clot that's formed recently. It hangs around in the circulation for rather longer, and it doesn't disrupt the body's own clotting systems, which means that it's less likely to cause bleeding problems. And all of these factors mean that it might be a more effective drug at opening up arteries and doing so quickly, and it might be less likely to cause the bleeding complications we wish to avoid. Of great interest recently is the potential that this might be a more convenient treatment. Our current standard clot-busting drug has to be given by an injection and then a drip, which runs in for over an hour. And that is a problem when we are living in an era when we need to move people with stroke to expert treatment centres, sometimes over significant distances, because in order to keep somebody safely managed with a drip running in the back of an ambulance when it's delivering a potentially dangerous drug, that often means that you have to send members of staff, doctors and nurses with that patient on the entire journey. It is much more attractive to give tenecteplase, which is given as a single shot injection, because that means that you can then treat the patient, put them in an ambulance and transport them somewhere without the same concerns. And also in other parts of the world, tenecteplase is significantly less expensive. So there are some significant attractions for this as a treatment for stroke. We do have some evidence that it might open up big arteries more effectively. A specific trial from Australia showed that we had double the proportion of people who opened up a major artery within the first couple of hours after the onset of stroke with tenecteplase compared with our standard drug treatment. So that was an encouraging finding. And we've also seen in studies that we've previously done, which were funded by the Stroke Association, when combined with information from other small pilot studies, that we might shift things favourably for people in terms of the eventual outcome. In the stroke world, we look at the outcomes in patients typically 3 months down the line in terms of whether they have significant disability. So a scale that we use would say people at this end are likely to be independent, people down at this end have some disability. And we look to see if we shift people more into these categories of being free of disability with one treatment compared with the other. And we seem to be doing that based on these small trials that have been done in the past. So altogether, these findings were encouraging to suggest that we should be investigating tenecteplase potentially as an alternative treatment. And that's led on to the ATTEST-2 trial, which is funded by the Stroke Association and the British Heart Foundation, and which we're doing in collaboration with colleagues from the University of Edinburgh and from Oxford. And it's a trial which is going to involve eventually over 1,800 people with acute stroke. We're treating people within the first 4.5 hours after the onset of their symptoms. And after they arrive at hospital, we are allocating them randomly to either get the standard clot-busting drug treatment with all of the issues involved in that, or to get a single injection of tenecteplase. After that, we follow them up, and the follow-ups conducted from our research team in Glasgow to find out how people are 90 days down the line. And we'll measure the outcomes to see if the two treatments are comparable or whether tenecteplase is better than the standard treatment. ATTEST-2 has been going on for a period of time already, initially with recruitment just locally in Glasgow and then spreading out to involve ultimately 30 hospitals across the UK. We had what I think many people will recognise in the clinical trial world as the COVID interruption, where we flatlined for a period of about 6 months with no recruitment being possible at all. And subsequently, as we've been able to gradually reopen, we have seen recruitment resume. People with big strokes continue to come to hospital. They continue to come throughout the entire pandemic period, and we certainly never seen any significant let-up in the numbers of people that have attended with major strokes. The hope is that we can continue to recruit at the same rate and see the trial through to completion and open it up to more hospitals across the country in the near future. In the first 1,000+ patients that we had involved in the study, the timelines are instructive because the onset from symptom onset to getting to hospital is an average about 90 minutes. The onset of stroke to randomizing the patient in the trial is 133 minutes. So we're taking 40 minutes thereabouts once somebody reaches hospital to do all of the evaluations, describe the study and enroll the patients. And after enrollment in the study, it's taking an average of about 7 minutes afterwards to get them treated. So the timelines that we work with are extremely short, extremely compressed. And despite that, 96% of the patients involved have completed their involvement in the study. We're adding into this mixture some additional patients with some support from the BHF, scans to give us more detailed insight into what is happening, studies that will look in up to 400 people at the pattern of blood flow, how much brain tissue is at risk and how much is predicted already to be severely damaged, how the blood vessels open up and how that translates into the final amount of damage that's there. And we hope that that will give us some important insights into who benefits most, how effective the treatment is at a biological level. Another study that's important is to address a common question we're faced with, which is exemplified by this gentleman here, who a few years ago came to our service with a symptom that had quickly improved. He had weakness down one side of the body, but this had got very rapidly better. And that's often the case and leads to people sometimes incorrectly calling this a TIA, a mini stroke. When we saw him, he only had some minor loss of vision to one side, and it's 3 hours down the line when he got round to being assessed. So the question arises in this situation, should we be treating this individual with a clot-busting drug or not? The concern is that obviously this is a treatment with some risk attached. Are we going to help this gentleman or are we not? At the time, this was, I think, Christmas Eve, he had better things to be doing and wanted to be off to deliver Christmas presents. But we were able to do in this individual some extra scans which showed us that despite his initial improvement, this was a temporary situation. He had a fairly major blockage in one of his blood vessels and a big area of brain tissue that was at risk with poor blood supply in the area responsible for vision. If not treated, quite likely that this is somebody who would end up with a significant loss of his vision and in his case, potentially permanent loss of his employment because he was a driver. This meant that we were able to suggest that we should be giving clot-busting drug treatment, which happily resulted in a full recovery, and he did get home, and he did deliver his Christmas presents, and all of that, therefore, had a very happy ending. But at the moment, we're still caught in this dilemma quite commonly. If people have symptoms that seem to be fairly minor or they're rapidly improving, we don't know whether we should or should not be treating with this type of treatment. Another trial that has support from the BHF is run by colleagues from the University of Calgary in Canada, where we're taking patients who have such symptoms that are rapidly improving and trying to test whether giving tenecteplase is a helpful thing to do or improves outcome. And that will plan to recruit over 1,200 people. Recruitment is already proceeding pretty well in a number of countries in people with these minor symptoms up to 12 hours after the onset. So I think my summary is very much that stroke, big or small, is a medical emergency. I hope the pictures have illustrated to you the importance of trying to restore the blood supply to the brain and the ways in which we can improve on what we currently rely on as our standard treatment, and hopefully also illustrates to you very well how the funding from the BHF is being used to support these major clinical trials, which we hope in due course will change routine care for patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, and to James as well. But Keith, thank you for such an inspiring presentation. I know many of the friends of BHF we have on the virtual call this afternoon will have been touched by stroke in their families and friends. So I know how important this work is to so many people. I know also that we've had a number of questions whilst we've been speaking that people would either love to ask of yourself, Keith, or yourself, James. So we're going to hand over to those in a moment. Before we do, Keith, could I add a personal one in? So it's so inspiring to see the work and the potential of it to improve lives for people. And you explained so clearly the connection between the circulatory system and brain damage. So thank you for that. Just, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself in terms of what attracts you to the work, what inspired your interest and your dedication to this area?
It seemed difficult. Neurology seems impossibly difficult to physicians, and it seemed like a challenge to try and understand how the brain worked, at least up to a point. So I think that was one thing that led me there. And stroke, when I was first engaged in stroke care and stroke research, it was in the early 90s. None of what I've described just now existed. We didn't have the scanning, we didn't have the treatments. There was nothing that we knew that we could do other than some fairly low-key things to try and prevent stroke if you'd already had one. But we didn't have anything that would actually make a difference. And it was an era when potential drug treatments were just starting to be investigated. So I was fortunate enough to be involved in a lot of the very early work that was looking to develop both the clot-busting drug treatments and a whole range of other things which proved to be less effective. And I think it's been a very rewarding time to be involved in what was previously a very, very depressing area of medicine, because it was something for which the perception was nothing could be done.
Thank you for that, Keith, and for giving us that inspiration and also that personal insight. It's really lovely to hear, and I know you'll have been inspired and given us hope today, and we're really proud to be supporting research like that helps so many people. Now, I'm going to hand over to our moderator behind the scenes, who's been taking your questions, and ask them to field them to myself, Keith or James, and encourage you to take the time, if please use the chat function to share any questions that arise that are in your minds today, or any comments you have. We'd love to hear from you. It makes these events the richer. So over to our moderator, please.
Hello, thank you. Yes, we do indeed have some pre-submitted questions. So the first I will ask James to answer, if that's okay. So I have a congenital heart defect and had 2 strokes at the age of 30. Are the BHF funding research into stroke in congenital heart patients, or the link between stroke and congenital heart disease, if any? And that's over to you, James.
So thank you for that question. It's a really interesting question. And we currently don't fund research into the link between congenital heart disease and stroke. We fund a large portfolio of research in stroke, as I've said, that extends to about £22 million. And that encompasses the whole of stroke. So the basic mechanisms that cause a stroke, the genes that might put you at risk of a stroke, ways in which we can detect stroke, and then ways in which we can treat stroke. And I think Keith has described those in very nice detail. So that research aims to deliver information that will be of use to everybody. And so if I could just maybe pick up one of the examples that I gave earlier of statins, we showed our research that we'd funded showed that statins were useful for reducing risk in stroke. And that applies to lots of people. And so people with other diseases as well as risk of stroke. And so we aim to understand the disease, the causes and the therapies, and then test those therapies in a wide range of people. So that's the overall objective.
Great, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the next pre-submitted question. Keith, if I can ask you to answer this one, please. What do you think the next big stroke breakthrough will be in research?
I think the biggest breakthrough is actually going to be applying what we already know in a more effective fashion. I think we have seen 2 huge advances, both of which involve restoring blood supply to the brain in ischemic stroke. One is with clot-busting drugs. The second one was the use of mechanical thrombectomy, actually physically going in through the circulation to pull a clot out. And both of these are transformative in terms of the effects they have on outcome after stroke. For those most severely affected, these are the big things, what we need to do is make them much more rapidly and widely available to people. And I think we'll see advances made around the fringes of this, where we will see situations like the Tempo 2 trial, where we're extending these existing treatments to other groups of people for whom we currently don't know whether they are effective. So I think for both of these, we'll see increasing numbers of people being eligible and increasing applied research in trying to get more people more rapidly to places where they can access the right treatment. So I think those are the big ones that we'll see in the near future.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so moving on, James, if I could ask you this next one, please. Is there a link between stroke and vascular dementia? If so, are the BHF doing anything in this field?
Another really good question. And the simple answer is yes. So vascular dementia is caused by death of cells in the brain because they don't receive the nutrients and the oxygen that they need to survive. And of course, having a stroke cuts off the supply of nutrients and oxygen. So there's a direct link there that stroke causes vascular dementia. Also, stroke may be seen as the extreme point, where blood flow gets cut off completely, but a dysfunction of the blood vessels in your head in their ability to deliver blood may be an underlying risk factor in vascular dementia. And so we're very pleased at the British Heart Foundation to partner with charities such as Alzheimer's and the Stroke Association to co-fund research in this area. So we're interested, obviously, in the vascular component of stroke and Alzheimer's disease. They're interested in those diseases specifically. And so we come together to co-fund applications. And at the moment, we have 3 or 4 such applications, which total about £2 million altogether. And the British Heart Foundation contribution to that is £1 million. So we are actively funding in that area. And it's a great way to tackle these problems, to link up with other charities that have specialist interest to tackle these problems.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Okay, so swiftly moving on, we've also got some live questions coming in. So next, a pre-submitting one. If I could ask Keith to answer this one, please. So how do you go about recruiting stroke patients to your clinical trials?
Well, as you've seen, the timelines that we're working with for these acute trials are extremely tight, and we're dealing with people who, because of they've had a stroke, are often unable to recognize what's happened to them, are unable to communicate, are unable to understand what we're saying to them. So a great deal of what we're doing is trying to very quickly speak to family members and relatives, which in the current situation with COVID is a particularly difficult challenge, both to convey the complexity of what's happened to their relative and to present to them the bare bones of what we need to have them appreciate about participation in studies. In some studies, that's a relatively straightforward thing, because to say we would give this drug treatment anyway, and we want to give one which is newer and may have some advantages, that's a fairly straightforward decision for people. It's much, much more challenging when you're dealing with very new things that you wish to try and test in people, where there's lots more uncertainty about what the risks and benefits might be. Adding extra scans is seldom a big concern for people, because again, it generally is something which gives you more useful information which we can use clinically for their care. But it's always a challenge, and the communication issues and the speed at which we need to ask people to make decisions is certainly something we're very, very acutely aware of. We go to considerable efforts to ensure that we have consent forms and information forms which are tailored as much as possible to all eventualities. So we have short versions of our forms. Sometimes we have pictorial representations of what's going on, and we have the capacity to include people, relatives, consent being taken over telephones or by video link, or getting consent from independent physicians who aren't linked with the research but can make a judgment on someone's behalf. So it's a considerable complexity to try and get people's engagement in these things with the speed at which we need to work.
Thanks, Keith. I'm going to be moderating the questions because Kelly has had some technical difficulties. The next question I will hand over to James. How are the BHF holding up at this time? What will the long-term impact of COVID-19 be on the BHF's mission?
So I'm happy to start with this, and maybe Charmaine will want to come in a bit later. I mean, from a research perspective, as I said, this year we'll have a 50% reduction in the amount of money that we can spend on life-saving research. All of the research that we fund is outstanding research. So this is not a situation in which we can just say, okay, so the not so good research will not be funded. All of the applications that we want to take forward for funding are outstanding. So we're in a situation now where we have to say, okay, some of those outstanding grants will not be funded this year because we can't afford to. These are very tough decisions to make. And I think, we appreciate the ongoing commitment of our staff and our volunteers and our fundraisers to keep the money coming in. But we have to face some very tough decisions. We don't think that we're going to rebound from this in a single year. I think that the news actually is full of the fact that this will be a multi-year impact and it's going to take a while to recover. But there is determination, I can tell you, within the BHF to recover as quickly as possible and to maintain the funding at as high a level as we possibly can. So I think that's probably enough from me. Maybe Charmaine would want to come in and comment on that.
Thank you, James. I would echo everything you've just said. There's no doubt that this is the single most challenging year in BHF's 60-year history. We anticipate our net income this year being down by 50%, and the knock-on you've heard from James is that we anticipate our research budget being halved from £100 million to around £50 million this year. And the reason we're so concerned about that is that it really is a cliff edge to the funding of research that supports people like Keith and our other researchers across the UK. So we are working so hard to take action to protect that. And that's everything from looking at costs as an organisation to being innovative in how we raise funds to as James said, recover. And what has been so inspirational personally is the spirit of our team of colleagues, of our volunteers and of our supporters in rallying around our recovery to make sure that we protect that progress that's most important to patients through our research. So yes, I know many of you on this virtual call today will be supporters of the BHF, and I again thank you. It's without support from the public, we wouldn't be able to do the life-saving research that we do. And I know you'll be as inspired today as I am by hearing from Keith and from seeing other research that we do about the potential it has to save lives and to be heartbreak forever. So it's critically important at this time. But a great question, and thank you again all for support.
Thank you, James and Charmaine. Another question that has come in is that I'll ask it to Keith. Are headaches still a common related symptom of possible stroke problems?
The short answer, no. Headaches happen in some patients with stroke, but it's seldom a major part of the syndrome that they present with. So they don't often get it as a prominent symptom. Technically speaking, we count subarachnoid hemorrhage, or a specific type of brain hemorrhage, as stroke, which is where it's totted up in the numbers. It's not nearly as common as the other things that we deal with, and it's mostly treated with neurosurgical approaches. And that's the only situation where headache is a particularly common symptom experienced in stroke. So headache in itself is not something that we would be terribly troubled about.
Thanks, Keith. We have a question from Ross, and I'm going to ask James to pitch into this question. And Ross said, we've heard a lot about the links between COVID and clotting. What do we know so far about this phenomenon? Example, mechanisms and potential therapeutic strategies. And are there any unique properties or characteristics of COVID-induced stroke?
So a very topical and interesting question, and one I'm very interested in, because my research focuses on a molecule that's released by blood vessels that dilates them, so it increases blood flow, but it also inhibits clotting. And our research at the moment is very much focused on understanding how that molecule is dysregulated in COVID-19 and how that contributes to clotting. So there is a lot of research going on at the moment to understand the mechanisms that are driving clotting in COVID-19. I think that we've seen a change in the way that patients are treated over the 6 months of the COVID pandemic. So lots of patients now receive anti-clotting agents as standard of care. So it's recognised as, you know, a very significant problem in the COVID population. I think it's really interesting to reflect that we are in October now, and this hit us in March. The amount of research that has been done in that 6-month period is absolutely phenomenal. The turnaround time in terms of doing experiments and getting data out has been phenomenal. And so data is coming out almost week by week, identifying the mechanisms and potential therapeutic targets that we might be able to hit in COVID-19. And of course, the Oxford University Recovery Trial is very quickly taking drugs that are available and may target pathological processes and testing them in human populations. So I think it's a bit of a watch this space, but there's an awful lot going on.
Thank you, James. We have a question from Jen. Keith, I'll ask this one to you. Are strokes hereditary?
So the short answer is some are hereditary, but the things that are inherited that cause stroke are usually causing very specific types of stroke and often linked with vascular dementia. So there are some inherited conditions, things like a disease called CADASIL that I'm particularly involved with, where there's a very specific genetic fault which causes a specific type of stroke and tendency to vascular dementia. But that's pretty uncommon in the generality of what we deal with. And most strokes, there is some inherited element, but it's a complicated one. And it's tangled up with the fact that there is an inherited element to a lot of the things that might put you at risk of having a stroke, like high blood pressure or irregular heart rhythms or heart disease or other problems where they may manifest sometimes as stroke, but maybe with other conditions as well. So there's no single gene that explains the most common types of stroke. And what we have needs to be disentangled from all of the different underlying mechanisms that underpin the different reasons why people have strokes, because stroke is one of the reasons it's very interesting to study is because it has a lot of different causes, and in every individual you're on a hunt for whether they have a problem in the little tiny blood vessels in their head or the big arteries in the neck that carry blood to the brain or from the heart. And it's an exercise in trying to unpick which of these is relevant, and until we do that, making sense of the genetics is really very difficult indeed, but there are definitely some genetic elements that are relevant.
Thanks, Keith. Another one for you, James. Is any research being done to estimate the number of people with atrial fibrillation who go on to have a stroke?
So that data is available from the studies that we have funded. I don't have to hand those numbers. I don't know if Keith has a better handle on that than I do, but those numbers are available. Yeah.
I don't have the figures right at the top of my head, but we certainly see a lot of studies where people with atrial fibrillation have been investigated and followed over long periods of time to compare different treatment strategies. So we've got a very good body of information to tell us what the risks actually are, and that's all put together. There's something called the CHADS2 VASC score, which is a sort of little acronym for adding up risks that individuals might have, which give you some feel for what your individual risk might be. So it takes into account factors like your age, your sex, whether you've had a previous problem with your heart, whether you've had a previous stroke, and tots up a number, and that will give a very well-informed idea of what the future risk of stroke is for an individual.
Thank you. Another question is, do we think stroke is currently underfunded in the UK? How do we link with other research in other countries? James, I'll pass that on to you.
So I think that that's a very interesting question. And I think a general comment here is that there is always more medical research that we could do. There are, brilliant people out there with brilliant ideas for experiments and a limited pot of money. So more money undoubtedly would result in more excellent research and greater insights into the causes and some treatments for stroke. So I think that that's one of the things that I would say. We do collaborate with other charities throughout Europe. So the German and the Dutch heart associations, we have co-funding streams with them, so to try to maximize the impact of our funding. And many of our researchers who we fund in the UK have very active collaborations across Europe. So that enables them to put together larger patient cohorts or share reagents to synergize and really get the maximum amount of benefit for the funding that's available. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, James. Another one for you. Do we have many PhD students going into studying stroke? Do you know that?
Well, I know of two because I've got two in my lab. So yes, we do have PhD students going into study stroke. And we have both non-clinical and clinical. So not by non-clinical, I mean in my lab, I'm a non-clinical scientist. We try to understand the mechanisms whereby blood vessels contract and relax to regulate flow. And blood vessels are fantastic structures. They're doing this all the time to regulate flow. So if you have an idea in your head, there'll be a little blood vessel that will dilate and allow a little bit more blood flow so that you can form a memory. And equally, if you start to run, the blood vessels in your legs will dilate to allow blood flow to your legs, but all the other blood vessels will stay the same. So they're wonderful structures. And the way that they achieve this signaling is complex, but we're starting to understand it much better. And I think we're starting to understand why blood vessels in the brain behave slightly differently to blood vessels elsewhere. And that may give us insights to how we might treat dysfunction. So we have PhD students doing that, and we have clinical PhD students who much more come in at Keith's end of things, trying to understand, what happens to a patient when they have a stroke and how might we treat that better and get a better outcome for the patient. So we have PhD students at both ends of the spectrum.
Thanks, James. And one final question before we hand over to Charmaine. I'll ask it to Keith. Vascular cognitive impairment is common to both stroke and heart disease. What can patients do to avoid vascular cognitive impairment?
Yeah, vascular cognitive impairment is really just part of a spectrum on the road to vascular dementia, and it reflects damage to the brain, which is accumulated usually because of the same risk factors that predispose you to stroke and are commonly also the same ones that predispose you to heart disease. So high blood pressure, diabetes, smoking, all of the lifestyle things that people are aware of are relevant to causing strokes, causing heart disease, and causing vascular dementia. Some more specific things do come in. Some of the inherited conditions are relevant. Maybe the lifestyle things are relevant to modify there. And things like atrial fibrillation, which is of much greater interest to stroke doctors than it is to heart disease specialists, because it very specifically causes stroke and predisposes you to vascular dementia. So avoid the bad genes. If you could pick your family, would be a nice one, but not achievable. Get your blood pressure checked, get your pulse checked so that you can be found out if you have atrial fibrillation. Watch what you eat. Do some exercise, and watch your weight. Don't smoke.
Thanks, Kate. Very wise words. I'll pass over to Charmaine to close off the event. Charmaine, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for those wise words, Keith. What good advice for all of us on this Wednesday afternoon. And I know everybody on this virtual call would join me in thanking both Keith and James for great presentations, but also for answering questions. And thank you to you for giving us your questions and comments. We really enjoyed hearing what matters to you, what you're interested in. And I can see that there are lots of questions probably we haven't had a moment to get to, but we'll find a way to get back to you on those we've not had time to address. And also want to share that I can see from Phil and others who've been touched by stroke in their lives or their families' lives, that there's a lot of thanks and gratitude for the progress that people like Keith and other scientists are making. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'd just like to ask you in the last couple of minutes a couple of questions if I can. So the first one, we might ask a repeat of the question we started with. So we've got a poll question for you. So going back to, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you feel you know about stroke? If you wouldn't mind just taking a moment to share with you. So 1 is low, 5 is the highest. I don't think we're giving out any PhDs this afternoon from Professor Keith Muir, but let's see how we've done as a group. Brilliant, thank you. I think that's coming to a close. I think we're going to publish the results, so colleagues can give me a thumbs up when we've done that. Brilliant. Well, look at that. So it looks like we feel a bit more confident as a group, and so I hope you've enjoyed that as well. But I think these data show us that we've moved from most of us feeling like we're a 3 to a 4. So I'm really delighted that people feel that they've learnt a bit more about stroke and the important research that the British Heart Foundation and Stroke Association fund in this area today. So thank you. And if we can ask you one other question whilst we've got you, we consider these events really important to engage with our supporters, because I think they showcase so brilliantly the work that we do in our life-saving research. So if you don't mind, we're going to ask you one question about, do events like this and has this event increase your likelihood of supporting the BHF in the future? If you wouldn't mind just taking a couple of seconds to give us a response to that, that would be really helpful for us as well. And we'll keep that private, we won't publish that, but it'll just help us understand what matters to you and what you enjoy hearing about as well. Lovely, and thank you for your responses. So we won't, that's just for us internally, but thank you for sharing your views, really helpful. And I know from the comments in the sidebar as well as the feedback we get how much you enjoy them as well. So without further ado, I'll again thank Keith for such a brilliant presentation, and James also for sharing so much about BHF research with us today. And thank you for your time. I know we've got a lot of people who really enjoy these sessions. I think it's a wonderful chance to get a bit behind the scenes intel about some of the amazing research happening today at the University of Glasgow. We really love to hear your feedback, so I know you'll be getting a link to a survey. Please do take a couple of moments to fill that in so that we can make sure our future events really give you what you need and also what you're interested in as much as what the things that we would like to share with you. And then just two last things. One, the Heart Hero Awards I mentioned that we had last night online are actually available to watch on our website. So please do take a moment to check in on those if you haven't already. Such an inspirational collection of stories and people's experiences. And I really loved it. It's been some great entertainment as well. So do please check that out. And secondly, we know how concerned that people with heart and circulatory disease are at a time of COVID-19. And to remind you that BHF is a coronavirus hub packed with information and support, and that also signposts our brilliant heart helpline that's available if you've got any questions or concerns or things that you think we can help you with. And lastly, I hope we can see you here again. If you haven't already signed up at bhf.org.uk/public events, please do take a moment to do. We love coming together with you as our BHF supporters at such events, hearing your questions and getting a chance to hear what matters to you. So we really hope to see you at a future event. And otherwise, we'll round up today by saying thank you for joining us. Great to have you with us, and take care.